Hello, everybody. Here I am again, taping another little talk for you. In this instance, it's not a formal lecture as I've been doing with some of the earlier ones. Actually, it's just a very broad and probably what is going to be rambling discussion of the film Braveheart, which most of you viewed for class, and where I find its various strengths and weaknesses. As you know, notice I'm wearing some different headwear today. So it seems to be sort of appropriate to the theme. So it's a Warriors cap, actually. This was given to me by a former faculty member at the University of Richmond. He retired a couple or 3 years ago, and a man who's kind of a legend within the department, a man named John Treadway. And he had this habit for certain people of giving them hats that are sort of appropriate to their field, and this is the one he gifted me with. And I had it on for in a couple of other occasions for very specific reasons. And since I promised we'd do a little cosplay, we'll do some mild ones here since we're dealing with medieval battles. In the case of Braveheart, uh, I should note before we get into it, I've taken a look at your comments that you put up on the discussion board, and everybody did, I think, a pretty good job with Braveheart. The general census seemed to be that people enjoy the film, but there is some realization that as a presentation of history, there's some problematic aspects to it. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be going into in my comments. Before we get into the comments proper, well, I'm going to say some prefatory things. And I think probably the best way to do this is just for me to sort of run down the questions that I gave you on the study guide and kind of respond to them myself. Uh, but before we get into that, just one quick thing on sources. When you're dealing with historical events, obviously, you want to know something about the nature of the evidence. And for the William Wallace character, who's the central figure in Braveheart, the main source closest, where a lot of the ideas, the legend of William Wallace is drawn, is from a man who wrote a very long poem, a guy named Blind Harry, who was working actually late in the 15th century, so he was considerably removed from the events that you see in the movie and that are associated with William Wallace, almost by 2 centuries practically. And so he's fairly distant. And you also have this long epic poem called The Bruce, which deals with Robert Bruce, the character that you also see in the film, who is a future king of Scotland and a Scottish noble during the period mostly that you see in the movie. So you have those two poetic sources for him, and then you have both Scottish and English chronicles that describe some of the events, and so that's what you have in terms of this. Now, I should note that one day when I was teaching this course or something fairly similar to it, and Braveheart was used, our discussion day came up. And there was one student who came into the class, and he'd been sitting in the front row actually the entire semester. A good guy, but he actually painted himself blue and white, as you see in the movie during the battle scenes. He was taking the film very seriously, and I kind of got the impression he was somewhat disenchanted with some of the stuff I said about it by the end of it because it shattered some illusions that he had. And that's unfortunate because I think, people should be more relaxed about these things. Um, and I'll just say just a very few general things about the movie itself. It's a very entertaining film, depending on what you like for your entertainment. If you like action movies, movies involving medieval warfare, that sort of thing, obviously, it would be your cup of tea. It was released in 1995, so how time flies. 25 years ago. At the time, I did pay money. I paid a ticket to go see it, like everybody else, and as I've pointed out to you on numerous occasions, I don't tend to go to the cinema to receive a historical education. I see the things as being two very different things. If a film is historically edifying, that's great. And if it's really historically edifying and it's medieval, I'll find some way to use at least some portion of it in a class at some point. But that's not my expectation when I'm paying money to go out and be entertained. And so I'm a moviegoer when I go to the movies. And my wife, in fact, has never seen the movie. She refuses to because she has heard about the level of violence in the battle scenes, and you have the execution scene at the end. She doesn't want anything to do with that, so she's refused to watch it. Um, Of course, as you know, when Hollywood, big studios make these films, they are commercial vehicles. The idea is to put people's rear end in seats, paying customers, make money off the DVD later, make money off streaming, although that wasn't something that was done at the time the movie was released. By the standards of a Hollywood film, this thing was a resounding success. You know, it was put out before all of you all were born, so I don't know how cognizant you are of this, but it won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director that year. Mel Gibson is the director and also the star of the movie. It made a vast pile of money, and so take that for whatever it's worth. By the standards of Hollywood, it was a great success. But we should note that when Mr. Gibson made the film, he may have had some purposes in mind beyond just the sale of tickets. He is a person with a very specific and well-developed set of attitudes toward the world, a particular worldview. And some of his behavior outside of his movie making is considered in many quarters to be somewhat problematic. And so what Mr. Gibson sets up is this question that we ask in terms of many people engaged in the arts. To what degree do you separate the artist from the art that's actually made? And Braveheart is a piece of sort of cinematic art. And I'm not going to, basically try to resolve that issue for you. Everyone resolves it according to their own standards on these things. I'm just telling you that that sort of debate is out there. And it's a current debate for a number of artists now. It's because obviously, I think Mr. Gibson's done a few things in his life that he probably wishes that he hadn't done now, and it's been a little bit harder for him to work effectively since these incidents, and it has nothing to do with Title IX stuff or sexual harassment. It's other issues with Mel Gibson. And I should also note, in terms of my own background, I'm a child, basically. I was born in 1960. Coming of age in the 70s, and a lot of my culturally formative experiences were in the late 70s, early 80s. When I was in college, like everybody else, you have that experience. And I should note that Mel Gibson is a big part of that. I was a person who, in terms of seeing movies in college, I first encountered him in the film Gallipoli, very young Mel Gibson, and I saw, The Road Warrior and Mad Max, films I really enjoyed at the time. And so he's had a good long career, and he's made a lot of movies that are still watched and are still quite popular, and he does continue to work. And so just sort of put that out there for your own knowledge and edification, and you'll come to your own judgments about this. I'll also note that at the time that the film came out, I was at Colgate University in central New York. My wife and I were both there at the time. And I had not what I would call a brush with greatness, but a brush with what might have been a type of local celebrity at the time. Because as the movie was coming out, it made such a splash that there was a desire to do news reports on it because they were selling a ton of tickets. They were selling it out. And one of the local TV stations in Syracuse called Colgate's history department to see if there was anybody who would be willing on videotape to comment on the film. And so they were referred to me, and I agreed to do it, and we began to make preparations for me to meet with the film crew. Basically, Professor Drell made certain I was going to dress properly. I tried to get my sort of thoughts together on the film because I had already seen it by that point. I had some ideas about it, although I would say these ideas have become more developed and evolved over the time as I used it as a type of teaching tool. And then what happened is there was some sort of breaking news, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but they had to call the reporters away, and it never happened. And so had this happened, there would have been some sort of videotape archive out there somewhere of me talking about Braveheart. We're doing a dim reflection of that today as I'm doing a videotape comment for you that'll go up on YouTube. Now, as I pointed out at the beginning of the semester, we're seeing several films. You've already seen The Lion and Winter. You've seen Braveheart. You will be taking a look at Branagh's version of Henry V, the Shakespeare play in film version. And what I pointed out to you also at the time is that we have films that are pretty good reflections of history, some that are kind of indifferent, some of them that are not quite good. And what I told you at the time is you'll come to your own judgments about that. I'm not going to prejudice this too much. But you should think about it, Braveheart also in these terms, how well you think it does in depicting specific historical events, a specific place and time. I should note that for this film, Mr. Gibson did not see the necessity to use a historical advisor for it. And you might want to ask yourself why he made that choice in a film that is purporting to illustrate specific historical events. Would he have found that constraining in terms of what he wanted to do? Well, it's a question to mull over as you think about the film. And I've seen this film over the years now since I have used it in classes repeatedly, probably 8 or 9 times. I've sort of lost count. Uh, Given everything else that's going on, I didn't watch it again this time, but I have the film sort of in a loop in my head at this point, so I didn't need to. But one thing I will say about that is with each viewing of the film, I've found it to be even a little bit more problematic. That there are new things I pick up on that I hadn't realized the first time through. I've also read more widely about the film itself in terms of what other people have said about it. So I've had this sort of continuous evolution in my own opinion of it. Well, where to begin? Well, basically, I guess we can first talk about the first question I gave you on the thing had to do with political conditions in Scotland and what's causing the toing and froing among the nobles and with the English in Scotland at the time. As it's depicted in the film, there's an absence of a king at this time in Scotland, and what you see is a depiction of a competition between Baliol and Bruce families, and that's fairly historical. But the problem here, as it opens up in 1296, is that John Baliol had already abdicated the preceding year, and so you're having issues there from the beginning. But what you do see is a lot of brandishing around of parchment rolls and stuff, which is a somewhat of a historical reality because in terms of having a king, it has to do with the ability to establish a claim. And these parchment records, obviously, of course, are useful for that in terms of genealogy and past agreements and arrangements and that kind of thing. And so it's good on that level. And what is also clear, and this is true historically, is that the major aristocrats had interest on both sides of the border between Scotland and England. And the way to co-opt the Scottish aristocrats, of course, is to offer them lands and titles in England so that they would have these interests. And so what you have basically is a division largely between the Anglo-Norman Scottish aristocracy and everybody beneath them. And the film's pretty good on this because the people in the upper aristocracy, they had these somewhat divided interests. And William Wallace was not part of that aristocracy. He was from a lower level, essentially. And so on that level, yeah, it depicts the issue in terms of who's suffering most from English activities in Scotland. It wouldn't be these guys at the very zenith of society. It would be people lower down. And basically, Wallace would have been one of those. So the film, I think, is pretty good, actually, on that specific point. The lower strata of society certainly suffered more from English occupation and had the most greatly developed sense of grievance toward the English. I think you can sort of take that one to the bank. However, even at this level of depicting this, there are some problems. That in terms of this notion of these nobles, the Scottish nobles being divided between England and Scotland, the film kinds to maybe try to indicate that that's a fairly recent thing, that Edward I is mostly responsible for that. That's inaccurate. That actually this had been going on since the 12th century in terms of developing these sort of divided loyalties based upon having land on both sides of the border. And so in this regard, the film is more than just a little bit misleading, and that's why you don't want to use it for an absolute sense of history. It gets some of it sort of right, but there are parts of it even on this level that it's not that great on. Now, so that's how it's portraying the general situation with these upper nobles in Scotland. To go to another question that's addressed on the study guide, this notion of the portrayal of the Scots and the English generally, and also what it has to say about Edward I, Longshanks, Patrick McGowan, and the future Edward II, his son, whom you see quite a bit in the film. First of all, let's just talk about the general sort of portrayal. And when you think about the portrayal of the Scots, they're portrayed in a very specific way. First of all, they're portrayed as being very religiously pious, very Catholic. They're portrayed as being very family-oriented. and they're portrayed as having very traditional values. And not to say that wasn't true, but that's something that Mr. Gibson went to quite a bit of length in terms of the narrative in the film to build up that idea. And you have some really good examples of it. Actually, the best example is probably the Scottish wedding that you see that becomes a crucial point in the narrative in the film fairly early on, where you see a joyfulness. People are playing games. You see lots of children running around. You see these sort of, and I use the term, in brackets, manly diversions. You see this rock tossing, this famous rock tossing scene in the film, where Gibson, who seems to be returning after some time, strikes up, puts together an old friendship of his. And I should note that the rock tossing thing strikes a little bit close to home for me, for personal reasons. You know, I grew up out in the countryside, as you already know, in Kentucky. And my brother and I actually had to ride, he's a year younger, and still lives in Kentucky, lives in Elizabethtown. We had to ride a school bus to school through both elementary and junior high and high school. When we were in elementary school, it was about a 3 mile ride into this little hamlet called Buffalo, sort of like Buffalo, New York. And then in high school, we had to be bused in 8 miles to the county seat in Hodgenville, where Lincoln was born, and you have the national park and all that business. And anyway, as we would wait for the buses each morning, we had this sort of half-moon driveway, gravel driveway in front of our house. And what my brother and I would do on many mornings is he would be in one side of the driveway, I would be at the other, and we would spend 15 or 20 minutes whizzing rocks at each other and frequently hitting one another, actually. It's surprising we didn't cause each other serious injury, but I've always been kind of fond of this rock tossing theme for that reason. And as you remember from the scene in the movie, you have this exceedingly happy event, and this serves as a really good segue in a minute to talking about portrayal of the English, where the English arrive and they immediately, actually, they're real party crashers and party poopers. You have this depiction of this notion that local English noble is coming by to exercise his right of prima nocte, first night. And what is suggested here is that he has the right, as the Lord, to sleep with the bride for a night prior to her consummation of the marriage with the person she has just been married to. What can we say about the historicity of this notion? Well, we can say that from a historical perspective, this is garbage. This did not exist. There's general scholarly consensus on this. It's a myth that was developed sometime after the Middle Ages. And this is where Mr. Gibson has taken something that's been discussed by scholars, largely rejected by scholars, but he resuscitates it because it allows him to create this sense of grievance, to illustrate it in a very compact way, because there was grievance there. There's no question between the Scots and the English. That's not inaccurate, but he's given you these very specific hooks on which to hang it, and he uses something that simply didn't happen to do it, not in that specific sense, and not in the broader sense either. It's a very fictionalized sort of thing. And it also helps him in his portrayal of the English, because you see this happy, traditional, family-oriented event. The English come and they inject something very dark into it at this point. As a parenthetical note, some of you picked up on this notion that Edward I in specific and the English very in general, they get a very evil portrayal here in various ways. And that's a good catch, because that's a very deliberate goal of the film, to create very clear moral categories. Scots, good morally and religiously. English, not so much. And so that's a little bit of what's going on with that. Now, we say here? Well, and in the scene, of course, this is where in the movie William Wallace spots Muron or Marion, and it's depicted as a love of first sight thing. You have a secret marriage, but even though there is a secret marriage, there is a priest present, and so that sort of positive depiction is continued. And what you see developing through the general scenes of the Scots and also the specific narrative in the film with William Wallace is the depiction of him as sort of a hero, saint, martyr. That's what it heads to during the course of the film. Very fascinating portrayal of William Wallace. Which brings us to the portrayal of the English. And if you think in very general terms, the English are portrayed as being irreligious, as being kind of immoral or amoral, as being decadent or deviant in some instances. Uh, you have a counterpoint in here where you see an English wedding. In this instance, it's the wedding of the future Edward II, the young Edward, to his bride Isabel of France. It is joyless. It is formal. There's not much this sort of sense of loose celebration that this is a happy event. The young Edward's desire to have nothing to do with his bride is made quite clear in it, and her realization through the French actress Sophie Marceau that is the case is depicted very clearly. There's a suggestion in the film that Edward I might have wanted to father a child with Isabel, which would be sort of a type of legal incest, actually. Father a child with the son's, wife. I mean, it's problematic, and it's again this notion of portraying the English, and particularly Edward I, in a particular way. Edward I is referred to as a pagan, as opposed to a more traditional Catholic at various points in the movie. And Edward I suggests a plan that he wants to breed the Scots out of existence. And so you have this undertone of a type of almost genocide that he would like to engage in. And so you have the English depicted in just a very, very dark place. And so this gets back to this notion of this effort to make Edward I specifically and the English generally to appear fairly evil. So you have this clear sort of moral divide between the two groups. Now, in terms of depiction of Edward I's projects, there are some decent elements of the film that we should note his principal concern during this time was with France. Scotland was an interruption in his dealings with France. He had already dealt with Wales by this point, and so that's sort of where he's at. And in terms of how the film depicts Edward I's conception of kingship, some elements of it aren't too far off the mark. That he's portrayed as somebody who can provide effective military leadership, and that's true. He was a well-known military leader. You see images of his royal council, and you do have these counselors around him where they discuss things through and they decide what to do. We should note in terms of chronology, as it's depicted in the film, you get the sense that at the time of execution of Wallace, at the end of the movie, Edward is on his deathbed. That is not true. He lived a couple more years after this, and this points to a larger issue that some of you picked up on. That time seems to be very strangely dilated in this movie, that events seem to be compacted, which is something that often happens in Hollywood depictions of historical events, because you have to keep the narrative rolling, and therefore you chop the narrative down to its bare essentials because it makes a more coherent, compact, quicker story. And so if you're trying to get a sense of the amount of time with the Scottish Rebellion and Wallace's career, the film recounts events over about a 9-year period, if you look at it historically, and they're shoved together in a very quick way in terms of the narrative of the film. But this isn't an unusual thing with a Hollywood depiction of historical events, particularly something occurring over a number of years. You get this very precise narrative. Perhaps the most interesting portrayal in the film, or one of the most interesting portrayals, is the portrayal of the young Edward, the future Edward II. And here we want to say something about the Edward II as we know him historically. In many quarters, he was considered an unkingly king, and that's sort of what comes out in the movie in a way. There was a rumor about Edward, that he was so different from his father, different from the Longshanks, that the rumor was this, that as an infant, Edward had been dropped out of a window accidentally by a servant while Edward I was abroad, and he died, and then was replaced with a peasant child. And the reason why the story gained some currency with people is that Edward, the young Edward, liked, and this isn't really depicted in the movie actually, but he liked to engage in what might be considered sort of peasant, low-class occupations. He was disliked and disrespected by the nobles, and he rejected most of the chivalric, knightly, noble pursuits in favor of things like cutting hedges. He was a hedger. He liked to cut ditches. He would go out and engage in ditch digging. He really loved building barns, actually. Interesting hobby. He tended to want to socialize with artisans, people who did these sorts of work. And I don't have a problem with that. I find artisans, people who are really good at doing something, to be fascinating people. You should be around them as much as you can, because there is a type of very sharp intelligence and knowledge that goes into doing these sorts of things. We lose this because we have so much of this stuff done for us. And these people, they're really great at what they do. And you always pick up a type of wisdom whenever you're speaking to people who are very good at their craft. So anyway, he was very different in that regard. What is depicted in the film is that if somebody was one of his favorites, he would have an unwavering attachment to this person. The person that's depicted in the film is a guy called Philip. And if you're looking for the person that this might have been a shadowy depiction of, it was probably this character named Piers Gaveston. Piers Gaveston. Gaveston lived, I'll get the dates for you here since I don't have them memorized, from around 1284 until 1312. Piers Gaveston was apparently Edward's absolute favorite, his crony, is sort of his best friend. And actually, if you're interested in Edward II and the Piers Gaveston character, there was a play by Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was a contemporary of Shakespeare. If you've ever seen that film Shakespeare in Love, that was made back in the late 90s, Marlowe is depicted in the film by Rupert Everett, the British actor. They kind of meet up at a bar at one point and they have a chat. He was the principal competitor in Shakespeare's day as a playwright and having productions put on the scene. Shakespeare never wrote a play, as far as I'm aware, dealing with Edward II. I would have to check to confirm that, but I don't think he did. Christopher Marlowe did, and the reason why I mention this is that when I was in high school, back before the Great Flood, in the antediluvian era, from Ural's perspective, my high school English teacher, our senior year, he brought the gigantic videotape, and we're in the embassy of videotaping classrooms at that point, a videotape machine in to show us a production that had been on public television of Marlowe's Edward II. And I was very struck by the play, actually, and I think if you get a chance, if you ever get a chance to see a production of it, you should. What's very interesting in it, from on a parenthetical basis, is that the principal actor in it, the fellow who was depicting Edward II, was a guy named John Hurt. And believe it or not, you know who the guy is, probably in your age cohort, because in the Harry Potter films, he was Ollivander the Wand Maker. In the late 70s, he was a very young man. This is one of his first big roles in sort of a quasi-Shakespearean way of doing this depiction of Edward II, and he was over-the-top great in it, actually. So if you get a chance, you might want to take a look at that. Now, of course, when you talk about Edward, you also want to talk about Isabel. And this is where it gets really historically weird in a lot of respects in the movie. A number of you already picked up on this, and this was a good catch, actually. It's the thing that people most often talk about in terms of a sense of unreality in the film. Basically, in the film, she is sent by Edward I as a sort of an envoy to William Wallace at one point. At the time in Wallace's career when this would have occurred, our friend Isabel would have been somewhere between 2 and 3 years old, and in France, not in England. The entire Isabel storyline is concocted out of Mr. Gibson's feverish imagination. None of that crap happened, basically. That's just completely inserted into the film, and it is beyond misleading. It's just not true. You can't. It's hard to find a basis for it other than the fact that she was eventually married to Edward II. Basically, she was affianced to Edward in 1303, 2 years before Wallace's death. But that doesn't mean they're married, because she was still very young at that point. The marriage that you see in the film is a chronological absurdity. They were not married until 1308, and that's 3 years after Wallace was executed. And so it's just nonsense. Basically, the movie places the marriage at some time before the Scottish Rebellion, which, yeah. In other words, 12 or 13 years probably before it actually happened. And so it just jumps all over the place chronologically at that point. Uh, she would have been roughly 9 years old at the time of the death of William Wallace, and she was still in France at that point. So that's just totally concocted. The one thing they got right about it, from the standards of the day, she was apparently considered quite beautiful. Uh, the actress Sophie Marceau was selected to do this, and she's been in quite a bit of stuff. She speaks 4 or 5 languages, so she appears in a lot of European films and appeared in a number of American films. Probably the best known from the American perspective is actually one of the James Bond films, The World Is Not Enough, where she played the character Electra in it. Uh, Now, in terms of their personal relations, that's not quite as depicted either. Actually, she had 4 children by Edward II, so it's not like they never had relations. They certainly did. But what's implied, of course, is there are implications about Edward II's sexuality in the film. We don't have any absolutely certain evidence about this, but there were some contemporary chroniclers who suggested that he was greatly fond of members of his inner circle and he neglected his queen. And so that's the basis for part of the depiction. And there is evidence in the chronicles that that was his attitude. If you're trying to get at what his sexuality is in modern terms, some people suggest that maybe he was bisexual. Right? You just can't know. He didn't leave anything written to reflect that, and no one comments on it with absolute certainty. Uh, there is an interesting allusion to him in the film. During the Siege of York in the film, a commander there refers to Edward as my sodomite cousin. And the reason why I mention this is that if people were going to describe homosexuality at that point, that would be a term that they would use. So for whatever reason, Mr. Gibson got that one sort of right. But when you're dealing with the Middle Ages in terms of sexual preferences and understanding of sexuality and gender issues, modern categories are not always especially relevant. And when we use the terms gay and homosexual as they're used in the modern world, they're freighted with a lot of modern stereotypes and baggage. And so it's probably best not even to go there in this, particularly since we can't know about it. What I will say is at the time, there were many people who were offended by this portrayal of sexuality in Braveheart, and you actually had people staging protests at showings of the movie. And so this was something that was going on in '95 as the movie was coming out. And of course, there's a scholarly debate about what's going on with Edward II. If you want to examine the issue of homosexuality and sexual preference during this period, there was a scholar who died a number of years ago, a man named John Bosworth, who wrote some fantastic books on this, and I would recommend you take a look at his work. He was one of the great medievalists of recent generations, and always fascinating, always interesting. In terms of having a son, Edward's only son, the future Edward III, was not born until 1312, which would have been 7 years after the execution of Wallace. So you can put that one aside as well, where Sophie Marceau is suggesting to Edward I on his deathbed that she's carrying something in his belly, a little gift that's going to keep on giving in the future. However, I should say something about that. At the time, obviously, you have this very sort of conventionally kingly Edward I, you have the unkingly future Edward II, and then when you have Edward III, you have somebody who is sort of a throwback to his grandfather. And people have often speculated about that. That's part of the reason why you get the speculation about Edward II having been dropped out of a window and replaced with a peasant child. And so Mr. Gibson plays with this theme a little bit. Maybe you explain this because that Edward the third is actually Edward I's son and not Edward II's because of what's implied in the film by the Isabel character. And so that's sort of out there, and that is obviously totally chronologically impossible and ahistorical as well. And so that's one of the biggest botches in the film that people picked up on almost immediately when the film came out. Anybody who knew anything about medieval history in that period picked up on it. Now, say a few words about the portrayal of William Wallace by Mel Gibson. A few historical notes from the very beginning. William Wallace likely never traveled further than northern England, so the notion that he's been all over Europe and in Rome, that's probably not true. There's no indication that he knew either Latin or French, that he was not this trilingual guy who would suddenly shift from language to language to language. Can't say it wasn't absolutely true, but there's no positive evidence that he was that well educated. What can we say with some precision about his father? His father was a man named Sir Malcolm Wallace, and he was killed in an encounter with an English knight named Fenwick sometime around 1291. And so there is a personal sense of grievance within the Wallace family from very early on. Wallace and his brother Malcolm had refused later to submit after defeating the Scots at Dunbar in 1296. And after 1296, he was living as an outlaw, essentially. So there's some truth to that. He engaged in guerrilla tactics against the English. And by guerrilla, you mean sort of hit and run tactics, where he wouldn't confront huge forces directly, but he found a way to be a perpetual nuisance as far as the English were concerned. As he's depicted, he was a giant of a man by standards of the day, with a large mane and brown hair. And so the brown hair certainly works with Gibson. Compared to other people in terms of size in the film, probably Wallace would have been even bigger than Gibson, if you can, to the degree you can know that securely. His family was a knightly family, but not an upper noble family in the Scots' perspective. Uh, he did marry a young woman from Lanark, Muron or Marion, but some aspects of the narrative, as Gibson give it, are a little bit questionable. It's probable that Marion's father was already dead by the time the action is depicted, so you don't have this notion of pushback by the father necessarily. Uh, in the film, he visits her by stealth, and there was some of this going on apparently. He ends up in a clash with an English patrol, fights his way clear, retreats to her house. He flees out the back way as the English troops are hammering at the door, and he went into the Cartland Crags to hide out. Sir William Heselrigg, the sheriff of Lanark, the English authority in the area, he was enraged by Wallace's behavior. He ordered the house burned and everyone in it, the wife and servants, put to the sword. And so, yes, William Wallace's wife was killed by the English. And this led to an undying vow of vengeance against the English. He was already upset with them prior to this. You don't have quite the same situation depicted in the movie, but there is a kernel on which that narrative in the movie involving Marion was built. To jump to the end of it, Wallace's betrayal and death. You have a submission of the Scottish nobles to Edward I at Strathern in 1304. That's after Edward had sort of cleaned things up, at least for a time. And it's clear that Edward I was mildly obsessed with Wallace. Wallace was excluded from this settlement. So, there is this personal animus, and that is portrayed in the film. The guys didn't like each other. The severity or leniency of the punishment of individual Scots leaders depended upon their participation in the apprehension of Wallace. And so there was kind of a contract put out on William Wallace by Edward I. He was betrayed, Wallace was, by a Scot named Sir John Menteith. And this guy had supposedly assigned a page to Wallace, and the page basically gave Wallace up. Wallace was captured in bed with his quote-unquote layman, L-E-M-A-N, a mistress. And when he is taken down south for trial, it was a summary trial where the accusations were made. There were really no deliberations. He was just declared guilty, and the verdict was immediate, and the sentence was carried out later that day. So there is some sort of historicity to this. I should know that there's one thing that, actually Mel Gibson got right about this is the depiction of the brutality of William Wallace's death. Actually, on this one, he probably underplayed it a bit. Because prior to his execution, William Wallace was stripped naked. He was tied to a hurdle and pulled behind a horse in London for about 4 miles. So he would not have been in good shape before he actually reached the execution site in what is now the neighborhood of Smithfield in modern London. He was hanged, castrated, disemboweled, decapitated, and chopped into quarters. This was the British practice of drawing and quartering, and it was a method of execution that the British used for the most grave crimes. His head was dipped in pitch and placed on a spike atop London Bridge. The quarters of his body were sent to various Scottish towns to be displayed as a warning. The quarters went to Perth, to Berwick-on-Tweed, to Stirling, and to Newcastle-on-Tyne for public display. Drawing and quartering remained on the books in England for a considerable time after William Wallace. It's a punishment for treason, and it was not, it was still in British law into the 19th century, not used. Uh, I don't think in that point. I have to check when the last person was drawn and quartered, but it was something that was certainly used during later Middle Ages, early modernity, into modernity by the British as a punishment for the most grave of crimes. And it was a punishment. Well, the notion was that you're killing a person 3 times because what they had done was so awful. Treason considered the most awful of crimes, and it was also a public spectacle to make a point. And so that was what was done with William Wallace. That's the one thing that Mel Gibson got more or less correct in the film. You can ask yourselves why suddenly, after playing fast and loose with a lot of stuff, he wants to get that one right. Well, obviously, it's a very dramatic way to end the movie. Now, the final bit we're going to talk about here is actually the battles in the film, because that's what a lot of people are interested in. How historically accurate is the portrayal of the battle scenes? And so I'll sort of take them one by one. The first battle you see is depicted in the film as the Battle of Stirling. Well, that's fascinating because the official name of the battle is the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And you ask yourself, well, why does Mr. Wallace, not Mr. Wallace, but Mr. Gibson decide not to use the name bridge in the battle? And if you look around, as you watch the film, try to figure out where the bridge actually is. Well, it's not there. Uh, so, and also another question, and this was a good catch by some of you, where is Andrew of Moray, who was the other principal person who was involved in this? He's not clearly depicted in the film. It's just William Wallace as the brilliant tactician and battle leader. So what actually happened? Well, in the actual battle, as far as people have been able to put it together, Wallace and Moray established themselves a mile north of Stirling Bridge. It was a narrow bridge. Only 2 horses riding abreast could cross it. On the other side of the bridge was a swampy meadow. And basically, Wallace and Moray were on the other side of the meadow at a high point to observe it. There was a narrow causeway across the swamp where maybe 4 horses could cross it, riding abreast. And so you have this narrowness, and actually ask yourself in the film, where's the causeway? Do you see it anywhere? Now, what you see in the film are just 2 armies facing each other across a fairly vast field. None of this stuff is actually in the film as the battle's depicted. Basically, what this meant is because of the narrowness of the bridge and the narrowness of the causeways as the English approach, they're not really able to deploy their cavalry effectively. And what Wallace and the other leaders did, they sat atop Abbey Crag and they waited for the precisely proper moment to order a charge. Apparently, Wallace signaled the attack with a horn. They said it's time to charge, and his right wing raced toward the bridge. They caught the English by surprise, and they took the bridgehead, which led the English to stampede themselves on the bridge. Some of the English soldiers actually jumped from the bridge and drowned in the river. The rest of them were basically slaughtered, who were actually on the bridge. The Earl of Surrey's vanguard, they were cut off. They'd crossed, but now you have basically Wallace and his people controlling the bridgehead. They had really no place to go, and they were attacked by this body of Scots spearsmen. Basically the Scottish forces ran through this ineffectual cavalry and slammed into the main body of the English army. The English infantry panicked when the soldiers realized the bridge was cut off as a means of retreat, and it was just an absolute slaughter. The Scots took no prisoners. They just decimated the English. Virtually every English soldier who had crossed the bridge was killed. Both those on it and those who had crossed it. The Scots then crossed the river and pursued the retreating army considerably south of Stirling. In other words, well, hate to say it, kids, it's an interesting depiction in the film, but that depiction of the battle is a load of crap. It was nothing on any level like that. If Gibson had had a historical advisor, he would have been told this, and it would have been filmed in a very different way. And so it's exciting to watch. Kind of gruesome, actually, very gruesome, but it has nothing to do with the historical reality that occurred at Stirling that day. Which brings us to Falkirk. What can we say about that? Well, first of all, William Wallace, as far as we know, was never in York. So you can put that one to the side at that time. And this was not a battle that William Wallace necessarily wanted to fight. Edward's army, who was pursuing William Wallace, they're trying to find him at that point at the time of Falkirk, it was short of food. And if Wallace had been able to wait them out, the English army would have been compelled to retreat. Wallace then could have engaged in the guerrilla tactics at which he was so adept. So this was not a battle that he wanted to fight to begin with in the way that it was fought. Um, the Scottish, but what happens, however, is that there's a Scottish party of scouts. They were spotted atop a ridge by the English. And so Edward I realized that Wallace's army was nearby. And the English army marches through the night to find it, to locate it. The area around Falkirk was too open for the Scottish army, which was dominated by infantry, to retreat easily. And if they had tried to do that, the English cavalry would have ridden them down. And so they're in kind of a tight spot where they're going to have to fight, even though it's not the place that they would prefer to fight. Wallace tried to establish himself again on some marshy ground because that had been something he'd used before. And maybe his hope was that perhaps the English would repeat the mistakes at Stirling Bridge. There was no crossing of sides by the Irish. If there was a basis for this, it was this, that there were some Welsh archers who in the days before the battle there'd been some dissension among them. And so that's converted into the film of this notion of the Irish crossing sides. That didn't happen. It's a nice narrative point, but no. There was no incendiary poured onto the marsh by the English to set everybody on fire. That didn't happen. That's totally made up as well. And there was no betrayal of William Wallace by Robert Bruce. Bruce, at the time of the battle, was 50 miles away in Ayr Castle. And so much as in the depiction of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, basically none of this is right. And there's also no hint of betrayal of Wallace by the other armed Scottish aristocrats. This didn't happen either. So it's made up from whole cloth, which leads to the question, what actually happened at Falkirk? Oh, as far as people have been able to put it together, and I should have actually mentioned this prior to even starting talking about the battles. As I've already pointed out, political and military history is not my bag. What you're getting here is what I've been able to put together by the best opinion of people who know about these things, who have read the sources in great depth. And I've taken a look at some of the sources as well to confirm the stuff, but this is what people who are good at military history have said about these battles. Basically, when you think about the tactics that Wallace engaged in, at Stirling Bridge, they were more offensive because he was able to plan out what he was going to do in detail in advance. Whereas at Falkirk, they were more defensive and where they were just trying to protect themselves. What Wallace did, as far as people have been able to reconstruct it, is he took his infantry and he arranged them into 4 groups of what they called schiltrons, Schiltorns. And I can probably describe this without drawing it for you. The infantrymen would arrange themselves in a big circle. And in the first rank, they would crouch or sit down, and they would point these 12-foot spears up at an angle. And then the next rank within the circle would be inside this in a concentric way. They would point their spears outside over the first rank's heads. And so what they created was sort of this hedgehog of spears, of these very long spears. And you do get to see some sense of this, but not originated as schiltrons. You see these spears that the horses run into. This is a way to protect yourself against cavalry. It's the only way that the Scots had of doing this, because this really causes problems for the horses because they're going to run into the spears and balk at that point, or not want to run into the spears, basically. And so it was the only real way that the Scots could defend themselves from the English cavalry. Edward I ordered the Welsh to charge first at them, the archers. The Welsh refused to be spear fodder. And this is where you get this notion of there being some balkiness, but it's not the Irish, it's the Welsh, and they're not crossing sides, they're just refusing to go across. So basically, Edward I then ordered his cavalry into action. And they had a difficult time crossing the marsh, and they were ineffective against the schiltrons. They actually sort of worked on that level. They were unable to break them. So the Scots are holding at this point pretty successfully. The Welsh don't move. The cavalry does. The Scots are holding them back. The difference became the Welsh longbowmen, actually. And actually, not the Welsh ones, but the ones from Lancaster. There were some bunch of longbowmen, and they were used with pinpoint aim to break the schildtrons and begin to shower arrows onto them. This is what broke them apart. And you do see a bit of the use of these archers in the battle scene, but not in the way it actually happened. It's depicted in a very different way. Once these bowmen were successful, the Welsh joined them because the Welsh were great at the longbow thing, as you'll discover in our discussion of the Hundred Years' War later. As the schildtrons broke, the Scottish troops attempted to flee. The cavalry then could become effective. They could run these people down, and that's what they did. There was huge losses by the Scots, and so that's how the battle ended. They lose that one. So you get the winners and the losers right in both battles. What happened in the battles in the film, it's just fiction. It didn't really go down that way in either of these major battles, as far as military historians have been able to put it together. This leads us to the final battle, which you only see the beginning of, the Battle of Bannockburn. This is after the time of Wallace. It's during the time of our friend Robert the Bruce. It's depicted in the film as being a spur-of-the-moment decision. No, 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 no. The Bruce had made elaborate preparations for this battle. And basically, it was an effort to mimic what Wallace had done at Sterling Bridge, essentially. And since I don't really go into the detail of the battle, I'm not going to belabor that. Which leads us to the final question. In light of what we know about the period, how would you rate the accuracy of Braveheart? Well, as it's probably already become apparent, I wouldn't rely on it, because there's some good elements to it historically. A lot of it is just nonsense, really. It's not one of the better depictions of historical events. And actually, one final thing. This was something that a number of you caught historically. It's this notion of the kilts. You see, Mel Gibson looks great in his kilt. I'll admit that. He's a very handsome man, and he looks great in a kilt. But no, they would not have been wearing kilts, and some of you picked up on this. One of you in particular who'd studied at Edinburgh, or was it Edinburgh or St Andrews? Well, one of the universities in Scotland picked up on this. What they would have been wearing at the time would have been belted linen tunics, dyed yellow, probably with horse urine. Well, that's really appealing. Scots would have dressed in the same way and manner most everyone else in Northern Europe would have dressed during this period. The kilts are later, and the tartan, that's a later development. It's a post-medieval development, so that is not historically accurate, actually. But it looks great, and it allows you to answer the question, well, what does a Scot wear under his kilt? Because they answer it in battle, I guess, at that point. This leads me to an interesting thing about the two films you've seen, an interesting comparison between The Lion in Winter and Braveheart. Basically, in The Lion in Winter, you had the reporting of all these conversations of which there is no record of an event that did not occur, this Christmas meeting at Chinon Castle. But most of the conversations that you hear in The Lion in Winter and some of the interfamily relationships, it's all pretty plausible, actually, that there's a type of very general historicity to it in the way some of these characters behave. Whereas with Braveheart, you have a treatment of events which are historical. These battles occurred. William Wallace was a real person. His execution was a real thing. His antipathy toward the English and Edward I in particular, and Edward I's antipathy toward him were historical facts. There's no question about that. You have a core historical record available for the event, but it's done in a very implausible way. And so you see two very different things going on in these movies. Now, this being said, even though I find the film historically problematic, I don't discourage people from seeing films like Braveheart. And there's a reason for this, that even if the film has pretty huge problems historically, what it does do from a medievalist perspective is that it boosts interest in the field, which I think is a great thing. And I think, what often happens is that as people see these major films and these major events depicted, they might then want to know more. And they will then begin to cast around to read more widely about it. And that's all to the good if you're a medievalist. You want the interest. In other words, you can't afford to be too pedantic about these things, because I think even though it may misdepict things and there may be other real shortcomings with the movie, it does create a level of interest in this field that you're studying, and the field actually, I think, in the long term benefits by it. And you also have to make a judgment about how damaging it is if people have misunderstandings about some very specific things, like the tactics used in a specific battle. It's better for them to know that the battle occurred and who won and who lost it, and what it means within the larger context of toing and froing between Scotland and England. And if people begin to read a little bit, they'll realize, oh, this is even much more interesting in reality than it was depicted in the film. And I always felt that on that level, these things are all to the good. And as a way of sort of bringing that point home, I'll give you a personal anecdote, actually, I think a fairly on point one and kind of a fun one. As you probably gather, my wife and I have been at other institutions in the past, and I'm not going to identify the institution here, and I'm not going to identify any faculty members by name, but I want to tell you a very general, true story. It is historical in my own personal history and my wife's personal history. At this preceding institution we were there at around the time that there was a miniseries done on network television, a making of Homer's The Odyssey. And it was a big budget thing, a big television event. There was some major Hollywood star power in it. Depicting Odysseus was the very famous actor at the time, Armand Assante. Calypso was depicted by the wonderful Vanessa Williams, the former Miss America, who was also a great singer, very good actress. His Odysseus' wife Penelope was portrayed by the wonderful Italian actress Greta Scotchi. And you had a lot of other people in the film, a lot of major Hollywood stars. As a matter of fact, Circe in it is depicted by Bernadette Peters, big star of stage and screen over a number of decades. And so you have all these Hollywood stars depicted in the Odyssey. For those of you who've read the Odyssey, and I hope you all have read the Odyssey at some point because it's one of the great works of all time, alongside its companion piece, the Iliad. And most people tend to read Odyssey more than Iliad, actually. It's a more accessible story that would drag in larger constituencies in most instances. As a depiction of the Odyssey is almost impossible to film. It's a difficult thing to do in any reasonable amount of time. It's so complex. And obviously, as a narrative of the story, a lot of liberties were taken in it. And at the time, as the movie came out, there were a lot of people, particularly in classics, who had a real stick up their backside about the Odyssey. They were offended by it because it didn't come up to their own personal, in their minds, depiction of what the Odyssey should be. But that would be impossible probably anyway. And no matter how you did it, you were going to displease some academics. Because there are disagreements about the Odyssey. Not everybody's on the same page about elements of it. And where this comes down to a personal story is that the Odyssey was taught in the core curriculum at this university. And since I was teaching in the core curriculum in the portion where the Odyssey was part of the course, I was teaching Odyssey, basically, and Iliad, actually, at one point as well there. And as you probably know already from listening to the preceding lectures, I have a minor teaching field in ancient. And so it's just sort of part of the sort of thing that I would be very comfortable talking about. Well, because this was going on in the core course and every student, every freshman in the university was being exposed to the Odyssey, and this film was out, it was decided that, can we bring one of the actors in to talk about his or her experience in filming the Odyssey? And they actually managed to snag the great white whale here. They got Armand Assante, the principal character, to come to campus, where he hung around with us and delivered a public lecture about his experience as an actor. And it was fascinating, actually. He did not initially want to do it, but he'd signed something where he'd created a contractual obligation to be in it, and then he thought better of it. He thought that, this is going to be tough. I don't know, it's going to be almost an impossible thing to do. And then once he began to back out, apparently his studio sued him. He said that I received a fax, there were fax machines back then, that was roughly the size of a roll of paper towels, reminding me of my legal obligations to do this. And he said, suddenly it came to me that maybe I could bring something to this role after all. And so he's involved as the main character in this miniseries. He delivered what I considered a very charming and fascinating lecture about, as an actor, how do you do this? And he admitted his own shortcomings. You know, he tried to talk about the history of things a little bit, but he admitted, I'm no scholar. You know, I'm an actor. This is what I do. And so, where the story becomes personal with us is obviously you have this very famous actor come into town, and there are going to be some dinners, and they have to get people sort of related somewhat to the field to agree to go to dinner with him. Well, the guy who would have been the most obvious person to do this in the classics department, he absolutely refused. He was so personally angered. He had such a log shoved up his backside over this, that it was probably a good idea that he not go, because he would have been very impolite and rude to this man for no point, you know. So this person doesn't go. So they begin to look for the next obvious people. And my wife and I, who were very young and very new at the place, we were brought in for two reasons. First of all, that we both have a bit of ancient exposure. My wife did a field in ancient as well. You know, we did all the same fields basically to some degree. Mine more modern one, more Reformation, her more Renaissance, but we can operate in both realms. And we had actually seen the miniseries. We'd actually watched it because we like being entertained, actually, and so we could talk to them with some knowledge. And they found some other people on faculty to do that. So we find ourselves at dinner with Armand Assante, the famous actor. And I will say, he is an exceedingly handsome man. And at the time, it was interesting. He had a trainer with him, this Croatian guy named Kresh, very charming man, a young guy. And the reason why he was there is that Armand Assante, for a previous role, he portrayed John Gotti in a film, and he had to, as actors often do, put on a ton of weight to do the role. He didn't want to do this sort of, CGI thing. It wasn't even an option really in the same way at that point. So he put on a lot of weight, and what his trainer was doing was helping him exercise and also monitoring his diet. And so we're sitting at dinner with Armand Assante, and basically this guy is sort of saying yay or nay to virtually every bite that Armand Assante ate during the film, during the dinner. But you know, he's a very charming, interesting man of wide acting experience, very cultured man. And so we're at this dinner with him. It's another one of these sort of touches with greatness that you get occasionally for very improbable reasons. But it also tells you that it illustrates part of the reason why I have a problem when people get too upset about these things. If there's something really horrific going on in a film, something truly awful, yeah, I can understand that. But in this case of this film that I found inoffensive, kind of interesting, not perfect, obviously far from perfect, that people would take this attitude. And there was also another funny feature about the film. There were a couple people there at that dinner that night who had said very uncharitable things about it. But it is this thing that you sometimes see among your academic colleagues, that being in the presence of the man who had a magnetism, it's undeniable, and who's a very charming man, you suddenly see people, more so than my wife and I guess because we've been exposed to, usually for various reasons, to some famous people at various points, coming unusually starstruck. And it was an absolutely entertaining, fascinating thing to watch. But this is part of the reason, from my own personal experience, why I don't get off my high horse too much about these historical films. You take them as they are. If there are things that are useful in them, you use them, and you allow the film goer to make their own judgments about these things. And if they want to know more about the history, you hope you can offer yourself as a type of resource to help people do that. But the larger thing is creating interest in the field. And think about it this way. Having this Odyssey thing on for 2 or 3 nights, or however long it was, as a mini-series that was much viewed. It was a big television event. A lot of people saw it. How many people then went out and actually read the Odyssey as a result of that? And so independently of any problems that the film may have had, this probably did more for general knowledge of people about the Odyssey and about classical Greece. And this is actually, you're talking about, obviously, not classical Greece with the Odyssey. It was written actually during the Greek Dark Age and emerges in written form during the classical period. And it depicts events during the Bronze Age, going much further back, 13th, 12th century BC. But more people probably know more about the true history of this period because of this miniseries than they do for any other reason, because they then went out, having seen the movie, they went out and read the damn book. And that's not half bad. And so I think you should bear that in mind. And when you sit see people get on high horses about these things, this might be something you want to point out to them. Well, that being said, I've said my piece for the day and ran on a little longer than I probably should have, but I am gratified that you saw the movie, that you got something out of it. And even though it has huge problems historically, I would not discourage you to see films like this. And and if you're worried about the historicity of a film, you have the tools. You're taking history courses. You know how to do this. Go out and then find out more and form your own judgments about it. And that being said, I'm going to check off for the day. I'm going to actually have this come up the same time as the university lectures come up. So this will be it is Wednesday morning, the 8th now. This will go live sometime later tonight and be available for you in the morning. So everybody take care, be safe, and we will talk to you more later. Bye-bye.